was born in a city called Embu, which is not so far from Nairobi. And I think I spent a large part of my initial years there until I was about 10 years old is when we moved to Nairobi. After that, I spent a lot of my time in actually 2 different schools in Nairobi. So I went to Lavington Primary School and I also went to Nairobi Primary School. So and finished my primary school in Nairobi Primary School, and then I went to high school called Nairobi School as well. So which is just on Wayaki Way. And so most of my life has been in Nairobi. After that, I did my university in Egerton University, which is in Nakuru, Joram, near Nakuru. And then I graduated with a degree in computer science, but never practiced it since then. I shifted my career in a different direction of leadership and business management, because that's something that I spent a lot of time doing in university in a students' organization called ISEC. So that kind of ended up shaping the career that I took later, because I spent a lot of time traveling to student conferences across Africa, across the world. So all those experiences made me prefer taking a career that was more in the direction of working with people rather than working with computers. Then I attended 2 international exchange programs after I graduated from university. So my first one was in Uganda. I was a project manager for a project that was running in in the middle of a forest near Kampala. And so the project was about helping people who lived in the forest ecosystem to find gainful ways of making money so that they don't cut down the forest. And then after that, then I moved to Norway for another almost 1.5 years on a different role as an international business manager, which was more a business development role. And then that was up until 2007. And then I came back to run a business that I had co-founded with a friend of mine in 2004. And so that's a company called Wild International, which is today a strategy consulting company. Although that time we started out doing trainings, especially in the area of youth leadership development, and then moved on to training adults in companies, and then eventually started doing consultancy in strategy, and then eventually we focused on doing strategy consulting for entrepreneurs. My career in Wild continued up until 2020, where Wild gave birth to another business, which is basically bringing other consultants together alongside Wild. And that's what today is now known as the Sandbox, which is spelled SNDBX. And so that's a new business that now I moved to become CEO of Sandbox in 2020, and left Wild in the hands of another, my co-director, who's a CEO there. And now I oversee Sandbox, which has Wild plus today another 32 consultancies, and our focus is really helping entrepreneurs to grow their business. So yeah, that's what I'm doing today. What I find to be the deep-seated problems of Africa, a lot of them stem from the history, and I would say recent history of Africa, recent history, I would say from the 1800s, which is basically that most Africans first and foremost go through an education system that was not created by their own people. And so you'll find that a lot of Africans will go through studying African history from the perspective of two main things. One, which is slavery, and then the other one, which is colonialism. And both are, in my opinion, very negative perspectives of looking at the continent from, because Africa first has a much longer history and even positive history of discoveries, inventions. So you'd find that a lot of the kids who will go through school will study an African history that tends to emphasize the slavery and colonialism. And also, if you go back in history, you'll find out that that same curriculum was not created by Africans themselves. And so there are things that are highlighted in that African history that, in my opinion, are very misleading as to what the real history of Africa is. If I'm to mention, several things, one is that a lot of the education curriculums will tend to paint the people who are at the forefront of during the changeover from colonialists to local administrators. You'd find that a lot of them are painted as heroes, and they're called, founding fathers and the like. But if you study alternative history about those founding fathers, you might find that they were not as heroic as they are painted to be. There are things they did that were not very desirable in collaboration with the colonialists that basically sought to maintain the systems that the colonialists left behind. So they continue to benefit, the colonialists continue to benefit economically, socio-economically, and continue to have a lot of power in the political systems of the countries that they left behind. And therefore, while it seems that the Africans took over, in leading the nations from, say, the 40s to the 60s or 70s, in actual sense, the colonial powers continued to have a lot of influence in how that changeover was done. Also, a lot of things that happened during the changeover, Kenya, for example, the government received money that was supposed to purchase land and hand it back to indigenous people, but that land ended up in the hands of elites who continue to own that wealth until today. So I think there's a lot of things that people grow up being very misguided about concerning our history that then shapes certain narratives that are not true about ourselves. If you go back to African history before the 1800s, Africa has a huge history of contributing to, I would say, global knowledge. But you'll never find this in history books. And so what a young African will grow up believing is that Africans have always been at the mercy of other people. They've always been subject to other powers, which is not true. And what that does to the mindset of a young African is probably make them not believe in themselves, believe that they can make, they can create, they can conquer, that they contributed to a lot. I remember all my science and history books and even geography books painted all the discoverers as Europeans, as if Africans did not live next to the physical features. So it also paints a perspective that things are only legitimate when the Europeans decide that they are legitimate. And so I think a lot of that education, and it has not been changed to date, and I think it's very harmful for Africans to grow up believing that only white people matter, only white people discover things, only white people do meaningful things, yet a lot of black people have contributed a lot to the world's history, and it's not recognized anywhere. So I would say, back to your question of what are the deep-seated problems. The first one is just our mindsets that have been shaped through false narratives in education, which our educators seem to have embraced and don't find a need to change, and I find that a huge problem. Kenya has revised its curriculum in the last 3 years, and they used foreign consultants to do a lot of that revision back to the whites. And I think Japanese and Europeans feeding into that, rather than, I'm like, don't we have educators here who can decide what the philosophy of our education is? So you can see how deep-seated the lack of self-belief is, to the point even the people running the education ministry will first run to foreigners before coming to ourselves to decide what is important for our kids to learn, what needs to change in the education system, what needs to change in the curriculum. And from my interaction with other Africans, it seems that this didn't happen in Kenya only, it happened in other countries as well. And so you find that problem tends to be even more pronounced in French-speaking West Africa, where that self-belief and self-esteem is quite low. And so, yeah, we need to change our self-esteem as a people. We need to change our philosophies about how much we believe in ourselves, where we go looking for solutions in terms of our self-determination, our self-governance. All that needs to change for African people to step up and take charge of both their own land, their own education system, their cultures, and how they interact with the rest of the world on the basis of all the different things that I've mentioned earlier. Yeah, I have had the privilege of traveling to a lot of countries, whether it's the US or in Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia. So I've had the opportunity of interacting with other people in their own countries and getting a sense of what they think about us as Africans. And in my opinion, some of it is very annoying when they find an African who seems intelligent, exposed, and understands world issues. It's a surprise to them that we would have that level of exposure and intelligence. A lot of people tend to only have a picture of Africa that paints problems, drought, hunger, war as the norm, because that's all they've seen on TV. And so when they get to interact with different Africans, they get very surprised at how there are very many different things happening on the ground. And so my experience, particularly in Europe, is what I would say started to drive me to want to come back home and make a difference, because I couldn't understand why a continent that has the best natural resources, best physical features, best weather, and largest number of people would also be the poorest. So for me, there was a big disconnect between what I could see on the ground and how I would see it playing out in terms of economies that are in Africa. And that made me very curious to want to understand, how did we end up in this situation in the first place? What are the different things that drove us? And that's why I got very interested in understanding why our education system is the way it is, why history that we learn is structured the way it is. And I would even ask myself, who came up with it and why hasn't it changed to date? And I realized that the way everything was structured serves one person or another's agenda. And most of the time, it's not the African's agenda. So while for the last 50 years, we have had leaders who are our own Africans, I don't know that in majority of the decisions they made, they were looking out for the Africans, or they were being controlled by foreigners who had interests here and who continue to have interests here in Africa until today. And so I think we need to uproot quite a number of things, and it may be to the displeasure of people in other continents for whom the current status quo, helps either to become wealthier. If I give examples of Kenya again, We are known for the flowers we produce, we are known for the coffee we produce, the tea we produce, horticultural products. But it's almost as if we do this for other people, not for ourselves. We are also known as primary producers. The value addition happens in another continent, and then the products come back and we buy them as finished goods here for much more expensive prices. And so such structures only continue to make the situation worse when it comes to impoverishing the continent, because the money is flowing out, it's not staying here. And it's not that doing a lot of these things is rocket science. We could insist as governments that the value addition to coffee, tea, and everything else happens here, and that they have to buy directly here, either set up the factories here or not buy at all. But that's not the case today. So as Sandbox, driven by that history, one, we are very passionate about helping people discover the real African history, help people discover that greatness was an African thing. We had kingdoms, we had wealth, we had education systems, we had health systems, we had, all sorts of agricultural systems that had been discovered and found here, and that even a lot of things that happen in the rest of the world, people had to come to Mesopotamia, Timbuktu, to find that knowledge and go back and use it. But the role of Africa in generating that knowledge is never acknowledged on a larger scale. So we are passionate about helping people find out these things, find out that great history, find out that there are parts of Europe that were colonized by Africans in the early 1600s, so that it's not just a perception that Africans were always the ones who were enslaved and colonized. I found out recently that there's a Roman Empire who was actually an African and passed on in the UK. If you looked at the geographical area, but was born in Northern Africa, went into the Roman Empire, grew all the way until he became a Caesar, and he was black, and then moved to Northern England, and I think died there when his rule came to an end. We don't ever hear about these stories. So we are passionate about first finding out about that African genius. They say until today the wealthiest man in the world was Mansa Musa, who was in West Africa. And that even until today, if you equate the wealth that he had, nobody has surpassed that wealth that he had then. Again, you never see that in any history books. So why is it that, that we as Africans are not finding out this information quickly enough and making it available for everyone? So as part of our brand, we are passionate about highlighting this information, but also helping present Africans find out that they have an inherent greatness that if they are able to discover and put out, then they can be able to go out and do equally great things as what the rest of the world is doing. Of course, we focus on helping businesses to grow. So one of the things we challenge our businesses is asking them why they have a very small vision to just build a business that, only impacts themselves and not the rest of society. I don't see a lot of Africans setting up a business and saying, I'm going to set up a global business. But when people set up businesses in Silicon Valley, Europe, or Asia, they think about it as a global business. Why don't we as Africans, start out with that kind of thinking? It's because, we have a very low self-esteem and don't believe in ourselves enough to think that we can come up with solutions that, impact the rest of the world. And so I would say our mission is to help people find out that they have that greatness, find out the different ways that they can go about implementing it, that, it's not rocket science to do those kinds of things. If you set your mind to it, you can be able to do it. And so we work with different African founded businesses to help them build the structures that they need to grow, to build a good brand, to scale, and to grow across the continent and even across the rest of the world. Because I think until we start to do that, then we will not have economies that build wealth for the local Africans. We will not be able to generate the kind of wealth that is synonymous with the land and the resources that we are seated on.